For today's agenda, the panel will discuss and make recommendations regarding the possible reclassification of cranial electrotherapy stimulator devices, CES. The panel discussion will include the existing data to support CES safety and effectiveness and whether the data are sufficient to develop special controls to support regulation of these devices under Class 2.
Good morning, distinguished panel members. My name is Dr. Kathy Platoni. I am a clinical psychologist, a colonel in the United States Army Reserve, and I am the Army Reserve Psychology Consultant, which you loosely translate to Chief Psychologist for the Army Reserve. Currently, approximately 95% of my private practice patients are in possession of their own personal Alpha-Stim devices. This was a difficult process because of the current classification. I sincerely hope that this process can be simplified if CES is moved to Class 2.
That's basically what I want to let you guys know is that as a treating psychiatrist, I need this tool to treat my patients. I've not seen any negative benefits or negative side effects that would limit me from using this, and I sincerely hope that you guys will take an unbiased approach to the reclassification process for this device. Thank you.
So what are the device classes? They're classified based on controls necessary. And a device should be placed in the lowest class whose level of control provides reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. So Class 3 devices are Class 3 because they cannot be classified into either 1 or 2 because insufficient information exists to determine that the general or the general and special controls are sufficient to provide the reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, and the devices are life-sustaining or life-supporting or of a substantial importance in preventing impairment of human health, or present a potential or unreasonable risk of illness or injury. Class 3 devices require pre-market approval, also known as PMA, prior to being marketed.
This slide somehow got corrupted since we've sent it to FDA, but that says medium down there, and that basically ours is small, medium, large, and very large. There's a small, and medium. And so, again, it compares favorably with TMS. And the reason we're harping on that is because this panel reviewed TMS in 2007, and the FDA classified it as Class 2 in the Federal Register July last year, 1 week before they treated us the exact opposite way. So they're being arbitrary and capricious about this between these two technologies. So based on the Alpha-Stim research that I've just presented to you, when taken as a whole, which is in the regulations, that wording, when taken as a whole, you're supposed to look at it when taken as a whole. The 10 studies that I just presented provide significant results supporting a finding of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. That's your job here today. Alpha-Stim is safe and effective for the treatment of anxiety, insomnia, and depression, and these conditions are ubiquitous in all patient populations. Patient population is meaningless. Since August of last year, every psychiatrist I've talked to, and I talked to several a day, I've asked this question too, and not one said, you're wrong. Every single one said, you're right. There is no distinction in patient populations for these 3 conditions. When you go to the dentist, you have anxiety. I'll bet some of you have been to the dentist and have experienced that. Did you ever notice how hard you're holding the chair? That's anxiety. All right. So adverse effects were mild and self-limiting in all our studies and across all the information for 31 years. So there won't be any surprises. A PMA is not going to accomplish a thing except put a huge burden on my small company. Now, I would, in some ways, prefer a PMA, but I have a PMA pending at FDA since 1995, and they treated us horrendously about it. They only met with us once, and at that time, the director of the Office of Advice Evaluation for Centers for Devices and CDRH said that there are no safety issues. So again, I think you could just put that one to sleep. Why isn't the FDA today talking about what the head of the Office of Device Evaluation said in 1996 meeting, I believe, as opposed to what the panel was chatting about in the 1970s, before I was in business for 31 years. We should talk about truth and reality. Okay, so we have significant effects. We have no serious or hardly any adverse effects to speak of whatsoever. It's sold over the counter outside this country, every place else in the world where it's been approved. And don't think it's easy to get it approved in other places. And don't think that general controls are easy. The FDA comes into our office every 2 years. Europe comes in every year. And these are not fun times when they come in to inspect us. Europe works with us. FDA works against us. They're looking for, aha, gotcha. But we're still in business even though we've had these inspections all this time. So today we have seen that there is reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for Alpha-Stim CES and no evidence of the contrary in 31 years of marketing, with well over 10, probably more than 20 million treatments administered. Therefore, we respectfully request that you recommend down classification of Alpha-Stim CES for the conditions of anxiety, depression, and insomnia. And I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions, because I wish I had 3 or 4 days to spend talking to you about my life's work, 30 years. 1 day per 10 years seems reasonable. 45 minutes, I hope I've educated you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before our next petitioner, which will
The proposed and final rules for the classification of CES were published in 1978 and 1979, respectively. The final rule defined the CES regulation as a device that applies electrical current to a patient's head to treat insomnia, depression, or anxiety. The classification rule listed a Class 3 recommendation because satisfactory effectiveness has not been demonstrated. These rules also included several other statements based on the panel proceedings as justification for the Class 3 recommendation. They noted that it was not possible to establish an adequate performance standard for CES because the characteristics needed for effective stimulation were not known. The rules also noted that CES presents a potentially unreasonable risk of illness or injury to the patient if the practitioner relied on the device and the device proved to be ineffective in treating the
CES has had a long history with the FDA, as this has been on the market since the 1960s in the United States. As a pre-amendment device, CES was placed in Class 3 until FDA could determine its proper classification. Since the 1970s, all legally cleared CES devices have been cleared through the 510K process of substantial equivalency. A CES is not life-supporting or life-sustaining, and evidence exists to determine that special controls would provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. Therefore, CES does not fit within the Class 3 classification. EPI has filed 5 separate 510K applications, 1 PMA, and 2 petitions for reclassification with FDA, all highlighting the safety and effectiveness of the device. In August of 2011, FDA proposed a requirement that CES devices would go through a pre-market approval process, and API submitted this petition for reclassification. EPI is here today to ask that this panel review the research and data provided to determine if there is a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness with CES, and if sufficient information exists to establish special controls so that CES can be downclassified to Class 2. Class 2 devices are subject to special controls, which include performance standards, post-market surveillance, and patient registries. EPI will show today that it has sufficient special controls in place to allow for downclassification.
CES does not have a performance standard, and there is no CES-specific guidance document. And as I noted earlier this morning, the classification panel recommended that this was not that it was not possible to establish an adequate performance standard because the characteristics needed for effective stimulation were unknown. And as we will present later, this continues to be our position.
EPI has self-imposed special controls for nearly 2 decades, which compare closely to the special controls recently adopted by FDA for RTMS.
The petitioners have proposed several special controls for CES devices if they were to be downclassified, including limited post-market surveillance, adequate instructions for use, compliance with voluntary consensus standards such as electrical safety, and that they would be available by prescription only. However, these proposed controls do not address variability in the device characteristics, especially with regards to the stimulation settings and electrode placement.
Placement of CES in Class 2 can be based on what is known about today's technology. For new devices that have characteristics that differ from existing CES devices, the FDA has the ability to get whatever data is sufficient to ensure that they are as safe and effective as existing devices. With RTMS, the FDA classified one device and one set of specifications in Class 2 with special controls that were sufficient to ensure that new RTMS devices would be as safe and effective as the single device that they allowed to go to market. The model established for regulating RTMS in Class 2 is equally applicable to today's CES devices, as well as new designs that may be proposed in the future.
I find no reason to deem CES a risky technology deserving of Class 3 status it now holds. I'd urge the panel to give CES its due and acknowledge low risk and evidence of benefit with a recommendation for Class 2 status. Thank you.
To quickly conclude, FDA believes that the available scientific evidence supports a Class 3 determination for the following reasons. The available data do not support a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness due to limitations as I've discussed. PMA review would allow for the collection of data on a defined population towards that effectiveness. Special controls proposed by the petitioners would not be sufficient to provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness because they don't address the variability of the device characteristics. And third, FDA believes that adequate special controls cannot be written based on the existing evidence, and worsening of the condition due to ineffective treatment is a potentially unreasonable risk.
That the blurred vision that you were discussing in your presentation?
Yes, you said that. Yes, that's correct.
So if the labeling said don't put it on your eyes, that would probably take care of that adverse event?
Well, that's not necessarily a labeling issue. I mean, depending on how the device was intended to be used. I mean, it's true that the devices that we've cleared do not use electrode placement over the eyes. However, because electrode placement over the eyes was in existence prior to 1976, it's conceivable that somebody could come in with a device comparing to a pre-amendments device that would use that type of electrode placement.
Okay, so special controls could be written that would cover to state don't put it on the eyes.
That's possible, yes.
You mentioned in your presentation the different settings that were used, and there was a large range of parameters and settings on the device. However, if you were to group the settings, were they all below the 4, I believe it's milliamps?
If you were looking specifically at current amplitude, then yeah, the studies that were included in our systematic review were below the 4 milliamps that we have cleared.
And then the frequency, not as in electrical frequency, you were talking more about times per day. Is that was your point?
Well, there's also the frequency, the electrical frequency of the stimulation itself, and then there is the number of treatment sessions. Those are two different things.
Right, and so with the electrical frequency, could they be grouped within a range of X to Y?
There are several specific frequencies, treatment frequencies, not including the carrier frequencies that have been cleared. It's possible. It may be possible to group some of them based on that, just because we have really only seen specific frequencies instead of being able to adjust it over a continuous range.
I have a question also about regulating specific dosages and frequencies. I understand that in some cases, like with ECT, the guidelines are left up to the practitioner. So I'm not clear how FDA goes about assessing how to determine whether the guidelines are left up to the practitioner or it's necessary to have that be part of the classification.
So each device in its approval range will usually indicate the specifications for its approval. Sometimes it's a range and sometimes it's a very specific output. So depending on the device in question.
I just had a very simple comment that the device is safe. There is really no convincing evidence of any potential adverse effects. You know, with regard to the stimulus parameter, we all know, you know, biologically there is a variability, and we see that certainly with other devices like the vagus nerve stimulator, the amplitude, the frequency, the pulse width, they all seem to vary in terms of what stimulus is going to produce the most optimum response. So that's all I'd say. Thank you.
The problem here, I think, is really the timing. If this was a new product and it hadn't been out and people hadn't used it, and we didn't have so many testimonials from people who seemed to me to be very credible, you know, it would be one thing. But that's not what we have. And to try to work backwards, I think, and apply clinical trials to something that's already been out in practice, widely used, I'm not sure I understand, you know, how that really makes sense, since the most important test is when it goes public and people actually use it. So since we all agree that there's essentially no risk, if there was even one patient benefited, it would seem like there'd be more efficacy than risk. I also note that the device itself runs on 2 AAA batteries, which is the same as my TV remote control at home. So, and that's usually pretty safe, except when my kids keep changing channels on it. So I think it's fine, and I don't see any problem with these limitations.
I would have to say for A, the proposed controls are adequate. I would have to say that for B, the clinician should be able to decide the parameters as they do with electroconvulsive therapy. And I don't think there are any more specific controls needed.
I agree with our patient representative. And I would also like to point out that there is another option that has not been brought up by FDA, which is that for a 510K, FDA can require clinical data in the 510K. So we could classify it Class 2. And then for new devices that come up, they could have clinical data that would demonstrate they are as safe and effective as the existing devices.
You're correct in that many 510Ks have clinical data. However, for the purposes of finding substantial equivalence for these devices, if it would be within the same range of parameters as is currently one of the marketed devices, most likely clinical data would not be requested should it go to the 510K route.
How natural. I would just have to say that I am struck by the fact that the FDA is considering putting this in the classification with life-threatening or life-sustaining devices. And I feel like given what the panel has said about its estimation of the risks associated with this device, that unless the FDA believes that there's no chance of any sort of benefit, that it wouldn't make sense to categorize it in Class 3.
Mr. Chairman, I have sat patiently through the entire meeting, and
Sir,
I had
I'm
a burning
sorry, but
question.
we don't.
Excuse me.
You're not permitted to
Call
address.
the police and have me arrested then. If that's your option, if that's the option, to be arrested or to be allowed to take 5 minutes of the time of these people, that's your choice. My name is Leroy L. Hamilton. I have a PhD from Case Western Reserve University in biomedical engineering. I have a very simple but very basic question that really needs to be addressed, and that is the definition of Class 3 devices. Slide number 70 shows that there are 2 clauses associated with the definition of Class 3. Those clauses are joined by the conjunction and.
Sir, I'm sorry, but the panel is not going to address your question.
That's fine. That's
You
fine.
just want to ask your question?
Simply go on the record. That will satisfy me. All right? I'll make this very quick.
Please do.
Second
Pause.
I'm sorry, sir, but we must ask you to have a seat, please. The panel, you may not come and address the panel.
Chairman, a choice to call the police and have me arrested or allow me a brief speech.
Sir.
Very brief speech.
Sir, you may not address the panel. Please have a seat.
All right, I will address the audience.
Sir,
The second clause.
Just to let you know, this.
The second clause is the device is life supporting or life sustaining. Which of you makes a device that's life supporting or life sustaining? I don't see any hands. Is it for a use which is of substantial importance to preventing impairment of human health? Now, if the answer to that question is yes, then it's efficacious. If the answer to that question is no, then it's not efficacious. And finally, does it present an unreasonable, potential unreasonable risk of injury or death? I think the panel has shown by their words today that they do not see potential risk.
sir, we have asked you to please have a seat. Thank you.
If you want to call the police and arrest me now, please do so. I'm willing to take a stand here because I have been watching, working with, I was an FDA employee for 2.5 years. I know how it works inside the agency. And they tend to grab me. This particular...
At this time, we'll take a 10-minute break. Thank you.
Thank you for your input, sir.
What justification does the FDA have to burden a small business with requiring them to go through the process, the onerous process of pre-market approval, when the same FDA allowed these devices to be legally marketed for 31 years, during which time there have been no significant side effects and an abundance of proof of effectiveness?